Hello, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thank you for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're delighted to be joined by Jessica Yellin, a terrific journalist and the creator of an important new news platform called News Not Noise. Let me tell you a little bit about Jessica. She is from Los Angeles, grew up there. She went to Harvard, graduated with honors, launched a career in journalism, beginning in Florida and just kind of working her way up through the ranks. Became White House correspondent for both ABC News during the Bush 43 years, and then during the President Obama's presidency was CNN's White House reporter. And she was also a congressional reporter earlier in her career. She's won a number of terrific awards, the Emmy, the Gracie, the Peabody Awards, and she launched her news platform called News Not Noise in 2017. Began on Instagram and has expanded into a podcast, Substack, and YouTube, and also other platforms. Jessica is the author of a terrific book called Savage News, which we're going to talk about. It's a wonderful satire on the news industry. Very fun, but also some really interesting points. I'm looking forward to discussing that book and just sort of the broader points it makes about the news industry. So Jessica is, as I said, is joining us from her home office in Los Angeles, and we're delighted to be joined by her. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. You did your homework.
Well, Jessica, let's talk about growing up in LA. I know in some of the interviews I saw, you mentioned that your parents were very kind of supportive, but also had kind of an ethos of giving back, of working for the broader good. Tell us a little bit about growing up in LA and just kind of the values that you absorbed as you were growing up.
Sure. In my household, my family was very big on do well, do good. You had to crush it professionally, of course, or in your school or whatever, but what are you doing to make a difference in the world? And my dad was a huge devotee of President Kennedy. I guess devotee might not be, but big fan. He was always told us that he was his personal page on the floor of the Democratic Convention the year he was nominated. And the one thing we weren't allowed to touch in the house, my parents were pretty like, it's LA, they're permissive. But the one thing we weren't allowed to touch were any of the Life magazines that commemorated JFK's election and JFK's assassination. And so it was very much about ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. We were steeped in those kinds of values. And it's in fact that experience that really got me into journalism. I read a speech John F. Kennedy gave when I was in high school. I read this speech where he said, and I'm really paraphrasing, he said essentially, there is a reason that the free press is the only private business explicitly protected in the US Constitution. And that's because our founders knew we need a well informed citizenry to have a functioning democracy. So I decided, gosh, that would be cool to inform the citizenry. Do well, do good.
And then when you went to Harvard, were you studying political science, history, English? I mean, did you have a pretty clear sense of at least the academic interest you had?
I studied American history, and then I also studied what was then called women's studies, which was a way to sort of take a politics lens and studied social movements. And I really looked at modern social movements and in the sweep of American history.
And as you were leaving school, were you pretty convinced that journalism was the path you wanted to take, or were there some other possibilities that you toyed with?
Well, everybody said to me, you don't have to make a decision. Whatever you decide right now isn't going to stick. You can change a million times, which is both true and untrue. Once you start on a path, you're on a path and you can change, but it takes a minute. So I actually wanted to go straight into journalism. I wanted to be an opinion writer, uh, and my parents had different ideas. My dad really wanted me to go to Washington, D.C. and intern. And I got an internship at the White House and ended up doing that instead of journalism early. And when I think about like how paths could have, what is it called? Sliding doors. That's one of those moments. I knew I wanted to be in communications, not on the other side, but I was at that point still listening to my parents.
And then, as I remember the story when you started out in journalism, I think one of your first jobs was in Orlando. and you were sort of a one-person band, or at least a small team, and so you were scrambling around doing stories, writing copy, editing, etc. I mean, talk about the sort of apprenticeship that you ended up embracing.
Sure. I was truly a one I respect man, or we call one person band. I didn't know anybody in Florida. When I got the gig, I decided I wanted to do TV news and I was going to pay my dues. And I got this opportunity to go to Central Florida News 13, which is a 24-hour cable channel affiliated at that time with the Orlando Sentinel. And they would report, it was weather on the ones, sports on a certain time, and then news in between. And they hired all young people to go out and get the news. And I showed up green as can be. I had never shot video with a TV camera. I'd never edited. I had never drafted a video script. I had to learn it all. And what we would do is we would get an assignment in the morning. We would get a number for your camera gear is in box, whatever. Get the key, unlock it, and you have all your kit loaded into your trunk of your car. Pull out figure out who you want to interview, pull out a map and figure out how to get there because it was before GPS. And you just did it from, what do they say, tail to snout, all the things. I even would film myself. You have to set up the camera, hit record, run in front of it, do your stand up, run back, rewind to see how it is. It was like, then you'd get home, write the script, edit it, put it on TV yourself. And I,
But during this time, as you were kind of going through the, as you call it, the 10,000 hours of
yes,
developing a mastery, you were pretty clear in your own head that you wanted to be a White House correspondent. I mean, that was sort of what you were working towards. Is that
yes,
fair?
yeah. So I had this intern at the White House when I was younger, and I noticed that there were sort of, I would always say, two things that could stop the room cold. One was the president walking into a room, everybody stops. And the other is what was then the only 24-hour cable channel, CNN, reporting on the White House. Everybody would stop and listen to what they were saying and then go back to work. And I realized that that had a lot of power. And I often thought, gosh, I think I could do it differently. I wanted to focus on different things and blah blah blah. And if I could be in that box, I would, focus on different parts of the news. And so I really set out to be a White House correspondent. And it's one of those things where you never know that it's going to happen until the moment it happens.
And the first one was with ABC, and I think you're doing primarily Good Morning America, weren't you? And then from that
Yes,
to CNN.
when I was at ABC, I covered the White House for Good Morning America, but I had the title correspondent, comma, White House, not White House correspondent. It was there was, I covered Bush's second term, the Iraq War, all the issue, Katrina, all those issues. I was in the press briefing. The person next to me was Helen Thomas. For anybody who has studied White House history, she's a legend. Um, and so many of those characters. I mean, not characters compared to what's there now, but characters at the time.
Well, as you think back on that time, I mean, what was the best part of the job and what was the most disappointing? I mean, what is your kind of perspective now on those years?
I mean, the thing that's remarkable about the job is you really um, can draw attention to things that you think people should know about. But I really thought it was powerful to see, during Katrina in particular, ABC News was among the networks that was into New Orleans very, very early and was on the ground reporting on what was happening, which was devastating. And the White House was in shell shock denial for about 5 days, really not focused on what was going on there. And I could literally walk into, the press secretary's office and say, please look at these people, please look at this. And part of what is remarkable is what is exceptional about that experience is your access to power and ability to raise attention around things. Conversely, what's very hard is sometimes it seems not to matter. Um, we can talk about that later. Uh, that wasn't true of the Bush White House. They were ultimately very responsive with Katrina. It just took some days. And I just found, the experience of being a White House correspondent changed dramatically as technology has changed. And the advent of social media and the speed with which information is shared on social media has really changed the relationship between reporters and especially their sources in Washington. Folks in Washington are savvy enough to know now the minute they tell me something, I could post it and it's gone. So that makes them either much more reticent to share things the way they used to when you could have a dialogue for a while, or more in this universe inclined to share whatever to see how it performs.
Well, cable TV has been the subject of a lot of discussion, and it's a theme in your book. But in some of the interviews I've seen with you, you've talked about just your sort of discontent with the culture of conflict that is so kind of endemic to cable TV. And I think it was maybe your interview with Al Frank, and you were kind of contrasting that with growing up in Los Angeles and being kind of aware of the Hollywood culture, which was more of a culture of empathy, at least in
Mm.
certain aspects. So talk about maybe just the culture of conflict. And particularly, I mean, the notion, you said this in another interview, where the sort of subtext in all of your reporting is, ratchet up the energy, ratchet up the intensity, ratchet up the conflict, bring on the heat.
Totally. I will say as a side note, Hollywood engages empathy on screen, not so well in real life. But anyway, that's another conversation. Uh, so listen, what started as my the conflict frame in news is true not just of cable news. It is true of TV news across the board, and some people might say more than that. And now it has been adopted and reified by the algorithms. And so what started in news is now on steroids in our feed all the time. So I would not make this specific critique to cable news. What I'd say is that, you know, anybody who makes content in a capitalist society has to find way to drive revenue. The way you drive revenue is by getting more audience, right? So that you can either sell ads or sell subscriptions to them or both, whatever it is. How do you take something and make it very watchable and not just want to watch it once, but extend your watch time? That's what everyone wants. If you're watching for 12 seconds, how do we get them to watch for 13, right? And early on, I think as I've studied it, it was partly the success of 60 Minutes early because news was a loss leader for decades. And then 60 Minutes comes along and shows you can make money doing the news. It became a top 10 show. People start seeing that conflict, gotcha, that kind of investigative, drama really engages audience. And 60 Minutes does it in depth, over time, thoroughly, and so they're doing real investigations. But a lot of the news culture just adopted the stylistic aspects of it without the deep, deep research and discovers that conflict and combat engages audiences. And so throughout the industry, one of the ways you shape a script, tell a story is around especially around politics, is making it like a sporting event. I've been told to make the story, more like ESPN, right? And the problem with this is it models conflict as the way we do democracy. It creates no space for centrist and moderating voices because that doesn't fill the narrative. And it also amplifies what we disagree on without really ever focusing on what we agree on. And so it has a polarizing effect on how we learn our politics, how we model politics, and then look how the country has emerged, gotten to this place of deep polarization. I don't think it's purely because of the news, of course, but I do think it is largely driven by that conflict frame. And I think the big problem is that these social media platforms have seen that this works too and amplify that in the algorithm. So the things that go most viral are the most conflict, divisive, polarizing, which gets us in this sort of doom loop we're in.
Well, I'll just tell you a quick story from my own background. I was a congressional reporter for many years before this job. And I remember one day, this goes back some time, but it was like the Senate, the leaders would begin the session. And there was this, about a 30-second verbal skirmish, I think, between Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell. Sort of standard stuff, a little snarkier than usual, but it was a sharp exchange. And then I sort of went about my day. I was busy covering budget hearings and so forth. And so I was maybe watching C-SPAN, but I wasn't watching the cables. So I came home that night. I was talking to my wife. She said, "My God, it must have been an amazing day up there." I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "It was incredible. Apparently, MSNBC had played the McConnell Reid clip in this endless lip and sort of the breaking news: Senate at war. Senate leaders in ferocious exchange." And they played the same 12-second clip endlessly all day, and you could be forgiven for thinking that the Senate was just in this nonstop uproar.
Yes, it is very hard. It's like on TV, where the camera goes, that's where the story it is for the public, but that's not the only story, right? It's the frame. I will say one like insider thing to know is that in cable news, most of the audience does not watch for hours. So the reason they repeat it is that when somebody's tuning in later, they assume people aren't watching. I used to get this complaint all the time. Why do you repeat things? Because not everybody's watching the way folks who watch for hours are.
Well, let's talk about then your decision to shift gears, and you decided. Well, tell us about the decision. I mean, obviously, this conflict frame was something that you found wearing and not really the full story, or the entire story. So, what was the process in which you said, you know what? Here I got, the dream job, all the institutional resources that a person could want, but this is just not what I want to be doing. I mean, tell us about that decision.
So I mentioned earlier that I got into it because I wanted to inform citizens in a democracy and I had this do well, do good notion. And then when you're climbing the ladder in a profession, I am a driven person. I want to succeed. I want to perform well. And you do the things you need to do to get ahead in that environment in terms of like do the stories that are going to get you airtime, frame it the way that's going to get ratings, all that. And I found that I was doing all those things, but I was spending a lot of my time as a campaign reporter. I was on the elections, out in the field interviewing undecided voters. And back in those days, 2008, 2010, 2012, undecided voters were heavily what we used to call soccer moms, suburban women who may or may not be college educated, but were making a late decision, right? They were swing voters or undecided voters. And the consensus about them in Washington was that these women are just busy and they just aren't paying attention to politics. They're too busy with their kids and their shopping and their homes, and they just don't know what's going on. That's why they're undecided. But I was out in the field interviewing them and I was talking to these women, and all the time, what they'd say to me is, I hate the way they go, I don't want to talk to you from the news. And it's not the reason people judge the news now. They'd say, all you do is scream at me, give me a panic attack, and then go to commercial break. I know less. I feel like I know less after watching than I did before. And then they would take out a list and say, I read this article. It says this person's going to raise taxes. Are they? This person said they're for childcare. What is the exact policy? And they actually were extremely concerned, focused, and not getting the information they needed. So I, started talking about, can we do this differently? Can we explain things? Can we explain? And I was noticing that on the internet, because YouTube was around then, the things that performed gangbusters on YouTube were two things we really could never do in TV news. One is, slow explainer stories that break it down in context. And two is happy, feel good stories that make you not panicked about the world. Those did great. So I knew there was an audience for information told differently. And it just kept like I kept noodling on how do you build that audience. And I fundamentally realized there was an unaddressed audience. I will say there were other reasons I left, like, personal life and all those things. But it was really this awareness that there is another way to do this that kind of gave me faith that I could stay a journalist and do it on my own.
Well, Jessica, let me read your mission statement and then have you maybe unpack it so we
Okay.
understand fully. And it's on your website. And you say, we break down the biggest news stories each day. We explain what matters, why, and what you can ignore. We give you context instead of anxiety. interviews with experts, not pundits, and we don't waste your time with jargon, angry rhetoric, predictions, projections, or punditry. We will leave you with a better understanding of the truth and facts so you can make smart decisions about your world. Welcome to the community. We're so glad you're here. So unpack that, and particularly maybe starting out with context versus anxiety.
Okay, so I come from the school of thought that when I understand a thing, I feel a sense of mastery or awareness that gives me a sense of calm. If if you tell me that Putin and Trump are talking about nuclear, you know, talking about nukes, and then you give me 3 quotes from different people about it, I leave feeling anxious. Is are are we gonna are we testing nukes? Are we gonna be in a nuclear war? Where is all this? If you tell me instead that, you know, Donald Trump is actually trying to test the missiles nuclear warheads would be carried on, not the nuclear component itself, but the missiles as a show of force to project power because Putin is also testing these things. It makes me feel like, oh, okay, I get that. I get it. I feel more in control. I feel more mastery. I mean, explaining the thing helps you understand where we are. And I think that brings a sense of potential calm. Um, it's funny because everybody knows what tariffs are now, but tariffs used to be my prime example where I would say, if in news people constantly talk about the tariffs will do this and that, free Trump. And people would say to me after a video about tariffs, they had no questions about the news. They'd say, "What is a tariff?" And it's so easy to say a tariff, comma, an added tax on imported goods, comma, and you bring in so much more audience that way. So part of it is defining your jargon, part of it is focusing on explaining the thing, and part of it is telling you like here's the good case scenario. The news is all about like the worst case scenario, here's the good case scenario, and helping people with their emotional experience of the news, which is extremely stressful. I will say my goal in the beginning, my motto was we give you information, not a panic attack. That was the motto, and still is, because the goal is not to try to unduly panic you. Today, the news itself makes that kind of hard.
Talk, if you would, Jessica, the distinction you make between experts and pundits. And I think I know where you're going with this, but how do you see the different worlds they inhabit?
So listen, when you're booking TV 24 hours, you need a lot of voices and you need a lot of airtime filled. And you find people who are good talkers and you bring them on. And so X and such person is, a doctor who has commented on RFK and they're really great TV and RFK's politics. So why not bring them on to also talk about the government shutdown because they're a good talker? And you're like, this person has no knowledge about Congress. Like, why are they on a panel talking about congressional debates? And I made up a straw man, but that's an example of what happens all the time. So my point is, I'm not going to bring on people to just punt, predict or guess. I'll bring on people who know what they're talking about. I would rather have a nerdy, wonky, awkward person who really knows their stuff than somebody who's sort of full of hot air saying words that don't mean much. Um, One of the prime examples of all this, it's a little different, is what I think noise is in TV is when the Mueller report was being written and it wasn't out. And they would have endless panel discussions about when they think the Mueller report will be leaked, right? Or when do we think the Epstein files will be leaked or will be out? We don't know. Like, why don't we save that airtime for actual news and then talk about the other thing when it happens? So it's sort of like I'm focusing your attention on where you actually it's worthy of your time.
Well, let's talk about sort of the mechanics of how you do your work. 'Cause I know you have a small team. I've dealt with a couple of your colleagues who are really terrific and responsive and all, but give us a little sense, like day to day, how you go about trying to get your arms around the world, and so you can present your report to your supporters and
So
subscribers.
So let me just say quickly how, like, I started off by doing short form videos on Instagram before Instagram supported video. So I just started making short 3-minute videos explaining what happened today and posting them. And I had to hack in how you get video posted. And by the way, it was so early that Meta used my account, traveled the globe with showing newsrooms how I do news and saying, do this. It's part of the reason now it's so everywhere. But I decided early on, I started doing videos every day. That has evolved into me not being on camera every day, and I post content about what's happening. And so I share this because Instagram is my like first platform. So every day we start with Instagram. And I have somebody who does a morning read in, looks across the headlines, looks across, key accounts that we like to follow, et cetera, and sends me what sort of the media and social media is chattering about and focused on. And then I look through my own emails and texts to see what my sources are telling me. And then I assign a certain number. It's usually like 5 to 8 stories we're going to summarize for the audience on Instagram. And then we have to figure out what we're going to put in the grid on Instagram to get eyeballs, because if we don't, the count shrinks and it's a nightmare. You have to just constantly feed this beast. Meta is a whole other conversation. Um, and then we have newsletters. So I do more context in newsletters. I found as Instagram is trying to compete more with TikTok, the incentives on the platform are for shorter and shorter content with less and less information. And so that has pushed me more to doing more explanatory journalism in the newsletter. Um, and I have a newsletter writer. We go over stories. He's amazing. Anyway, it's a newsroom. And then we do interviews, and we try to figure out how to get all of it up. There is never a day that feels like that was such a smooth process. Everything's, hair on fire. When you and I are done, I'm going to have a text box full of this happened and this happened. And should I post this? And is this wording okay? And is this funny or offensive? And blah, like it's just nonstop. So you learn to be kind of calm in the storm because there's always a storm. That's
Well,
creator
Jessica, I
world.
saw
Yeah.
a terrific interview you did. It was on, I think, November 5th. It was right the day after the November 4th election with Rahm Emanuel. 20, 25 minute interview in which he analyzed the elections and in a really kind of thoughtful and interesting way. You were able to kind of coax him into suggesting he was running for president. I mean, he seemed to be walking there pretty briskly. Um, Talk about just like the interview piece. I mean, do you try to do a couple of those a week, or is it just kind of dependent on events and opportunities?
I mean, I used to do an interview a day. When I was Instagram first, I did one a day, um, and several a week. And then I've ratcheted it back. People get overwhelmed by the amount of content in their inboxes. So, and I get overwhelmed by the amount I have to juggle. But my, I enjoy interview. If I enjoy an interview, it's going to be a good interview. If I kind of am not, I think there's probably, and so I try to follow my own interests. And my favorite interviews are with people who are explaining things to me that I don't know and to the audience that I don't know. And I think that, um, in the case of Rom, he is obviously many things, ambassador, chief of staff, but he's a really savvy political strategist. And so it's interesting to hear his framing, whether you agree or not. It's a pure insight into a perspective on how to win from one perspective. Um, so he fits that mold. But I also love interviewing, I'm interviewing a doctor soon on this new ruling on HRT and menopause meds. And like, is that good? Is it bad? Let's really dig in and explain it to me. That's the kind of interview I like to do. I know that the kind of interviews that journalists are generally rewarded for are booking famous names, right? And I think that's interesting when you're getting at something fresh. But my goal with interviews is the same thing, to help use the conversation to unpack something for the audience so they leave understanding something they felt they didn't understand before.
Well, you had mentioned a newsletter, and I've been reading yours, and I really like them. And I want to just spend a second on one. It was from November 10th. It was as the shutdown was ending, and the headline was it was a question mark: complete betrayal or only deal on the table? Why Democrats broke ranks to end the shutdown. And you began by saying the Senate is voting now to end the shutdown, and my inbox has become a monument to Democratic despair. And then you said some are livid that the party let people suffer only to cave without extracting a single win. But the part that as I looked at the newsletter, it was really interesting because you laid out clearly, what were the arguments for, breaking and the deal? What were the arguments against it? What are the prospects going forward in terms of, the funding bill only running until January? Use that newsletter, if you would, as kind of a template for what you try to do in your
Sure.
writing and reporting.
So thank you. You really do your research. I found that I'm going to use this example. So that day there was this sort of rush to judgment where activists and base Democrats were just in a state of just misery and despair because they thought that the Democrats were giving it all away. And whenever there's like a narrative that feels like a mob, something in me is like, what's the counter? I want to look into the counter. I just feel like there's always more to the story, and when there's too much conformity and unanimity, there's another story to be told. And I started thinking about it, and I explained what is the logic for this decision to open the government, because I also looked at that and said Dick Durbin, who's number 2 in leadership and one of the most senior people in the Democratic Party and quite liberal himself, voted to reopen government. That tells me that Democratic leadership organized this, wanted it to happen. He was taking the fall, and there was a strategic reason they decided to reopen government. So, what were those reasons? And I laid it out in a way that I think, and I said to people, like, if I were in Senate, I don't think I would have reopened government. I would have just kept in the fight, which, by the way, a lot of journalists wouldn't do that. I'm free, I'm independent, I can do it. But I said, I want you to understand that basically why it's a defensible position reopening. And, there are many things Democrats did in the shutdown fight that were wins, namely, so, and how do I, that were wins, namely, the extension of these ACA subsidies that they made a big deal about. We're never going to pass a Republican Congress. They're just not going to pass it. And I actually feel bad that it was like it misled a lot of people into thinking that their health care might be protected next year. It just was never on the table, really. Had they held out longer and created some kind of crisis in America, who knows? But who knows what the downside costs would have been? I just think laying all that out helps people feel like, oh, there is a logic to why our leaders are doing what they do. Everything isn't opaque to me. I'm not too dumb or naive or disconnected or powerless to get it. I get it. I don't agree with it, maybe, but I get it. And that gives me a sense of understanding, which gives me a sense of control, which is calming. And that in turn leads me to be more engaged, more attentive, even participate in community and civic life.
Great. Well, Jessica, you wrote a terrific essay in The Atlantic in August, and I want to read a couple sentences and maybe have you expand. You say, you begin by saying there's a quiet revolution in how millions of Americans decide what is real. Trust is slipping away from traditional institutions, media, government, and higher education, and shifting, excuse me, to individual voices online, among them social media creators. Then you go on to say the popular notion that social media is just a dumpster fire of viral lies misses something vital. Millions of people still care about the truth. They are seeking facts on social media from credible voices they can trust. They just aren't always sure where to find them or from whom. So go to town on that. I mean, what was maybe even just the impetus of the article? It seemed like you wanted to really kind of frame how this kind of revolution in the media is starting to unfold, and kind of connected it to the work that you are doing.
Sure. So I obviously do the news, and social media is one of my main distribution platforms. There's a universe of people like me who are also what I call evidence-based creators. They are doctors, PhD nutritionists, economists, data scientists, the list goes on, who are doing their work unheralded with enormous incentives to stop doing it conscientiously. The algorithms, the platforms, all of it, the incentives are aligned to, frankly, be as dramatic and overstated as possible, make every, do what you want to make money and get clicks. There is crazy data that shows, north of 60% of creators who are selling you something never reveal that they're the ones making money off the thing. Like directly, you're buying it from them. They don't, something like 70% don't fact check what they're saying or know how to fact check what they're saying. And, there's this weird polarity I've experienced where traditional journalism and journalists and the people who are at think tanks and universities and academia think hard about the future of journalism don't understand or see until recently haven't understood or seen that there is this universe of evidence-based trusted messengers on social media who are doing quality work. It's just that social media, all of it is problematized. And at the same time, 54% of Americans are getting their news on social media, their information. So we can't continue to pretend that social media doesn't matter or has to be like ignored. And it's important to recognize that there are people on social media who are trying to do the right thing. And what they need is infrastructure. What we need is infrastructure. And we need a different approach to thinking about who is a fact teller on social media. How are we doing it? What do we need? And how can we partner? So my goal was first to sort of puncture this myth that everybody on social media is just like an idiot trying to, lie to you to make to grift. And second, to talk about how we could think about some solutions, right? Every conversation I have around this is about the problem and the inadequacy of any solution. And my view is nothing's perfect. You got to start. So the goal was to lay out a couple of strategies to address some of our problems. The problems being one, resourcing and supporting the people who are doing evidence based work so they can continue to do it despite the undertow and have a reasonable life. Like the mental health crisis for social media creators is real. And two, how do we create signals so the public can tell the difference between somebody who is a grifter and somebody who's an evidence-based person?
Well, you had a wonderful turn of phrase in the article. You say, we are independent voices operating without safety nets. I'd like to think of us as the digital equivalent of artisanal chefs working in a factory for mass produced junk food. The very things that make us valuable, our obsession with facts, our commitment to nuance, our hours spent answering audience questions and apps, put us at a profound disadvantage in the attention economy. Our secret weapon is trust.
I mean, I always say this, the number one question I get is from my audience is this true? And they'll forward me something that's either an article or a post or something. And I'll say to the person, you know, I'll give them the answer and I'll say, listen, I just want to tell you, here's how I would do the Google search on this. And so you could, verify in the future yourself. Not as a mean thing, but to basically, don't just give them the fish, teach them how to fish. And I stopped doing that because universally people would reply to me and say, "Oh, of course I know how to do the Google search, but it'll deliver 20 million results and I don't know what's real. I trust you. You can tell me what's real." And I started to realize that the challenge is that people no longer trust their own sense of discernment. They don't know how to discern what or who to trust. And so once you have their trust, they imbue you with a lot of expertise and want your insight on things that are even outside your, you know, domain because you've built that relationship. And so I get questions like, my son needs to have an operation and two doctors are saying two different things. Who should I believe? And I'll say, I have no expertise in this. I feel for you. I don't want to weigh, and they'll weigh in and they'll say, no, but you're so good at figuring out what's real and who's smart. Can you? So you realize like our crisis is not just disinformation. It's that the audience has lost faith in all voices of, many voices of authority and their own ability to tell what's real. And we need to create signals that help people do this for themselves.
Well, there was a report that just came out in the last week or so from Carnegie. Rachel Kleinfeld and Renee DiResta wrote it on how the media environment has changed. And one of the things they focused on, and it's interesting, it's something that you've written about in your book. I'm going to get your book in a second, is this whole notion of kind of declining respect for expertise and a growing importance of, quote, authenticity. Um, and they say in the report, they say immediacy and informality seems authentic and truthful. Polished institutional or expert statements that have taken a bit of time to go through a fact checking process, come across as potentially manipulative, overly cautious, or influenced by corporate or political interests. Then they go on to say audiences frequently interpret messiness, speed, and raw emotional expression as signs of truthfulness. Influencers win attention and legitimacy via authenticity, reliability, and direct audience connection. That's a lot of words out there, but just this whole notion of this perception of authenticity and how that has come to displace a kind of a respect for expertise.
That's so interesting. So these words, authenticity, relatability, connect with the audience. I started hearing those when I was in TV news in the early 2000s. And that was stuff that consultants would tell reporters we have to work on. This is not particular to now. It is not new to social. It is not new. It is not particular to social media. Again, social media put a thing that was true on steroids. Um, I believe that all the things they're describing are 100% like, yes, 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 and those are the stylistic things. It does not mean that you can't, it does, it does not mean that there's no value in expertise, that audiences don't value expertise. They they want the experts. An online audience trusts you more when you show up the way they're talking about. It doesn't mean like some of the hottest new influencers right now who are blowing up are my friend who's a PhD nutritionist who takes the piss out of RFK's BS statements all the time in really detailed scientific videos explaining what's actually wrong and how he's using these names of chemicals, but really it's just this simple compound and it sounds bad. She's sounds like an expert, but she's real. And so I think that it is not the need for authenticity that devalues expertise. I think it's the fact that experts traditionally show up in a really uptight, traditional corporatist corporate way. And when you find people who can communicate better, um, it's sort of value neutral on whether, I mean, that's the problem. They're just as happy to hear it from Joe Rogan, right? Um, and that's partly because, what is a credential these days, blah, blah, longer conversation. But I think that this doesn't, we don't have to sing a sad song about this. We could actually learn from this. How do you train experts to communicate in a way that feels authentic?
Jessica, just kind of a word of semantics. The term creator, you use evidence-based creator versus influencer. I mean, in your world, how are they different?
So, I mean, they're technically the same thing, except a creator actually creates content. I think of it as um the work, the thrust of the work is in providing information in or original work to the audience, right? If you can be a creator who's doing cooking and so you're not reporting, but it's explaining a recipe. Influencers are people who build audience to sell stuff and to influence people to wear what they like, dress what they like, exercise their way. It's a little more about it's a more of a sales focused, image focused relationship, or they're, you know, just advertising their lifestyle to build their brand. Whereas creators, I think, are in the more of the knowledge economy and trying to, in some way, either inform you or create a artistic product that has an emotional impact on you. So there's more of a creative component in that regard. I
Okay.
also just don't want to be called an influencer.
Okay. We will not call you an influencer.
The one thing I will flag is the reason I use evidence-based creator is because now facts are political. Using the term fact is political and facts have enemies. And truth teller, what is truth? How do you define it? Who's to say? And so I always say evidence based just means you have sourcing for what you're saying. And when the evidence changes, your reporting changes.
Okay. Well, Jessica, I want to talk about your book, which I started reading this weekend. I have to say, I'm not done, but I'm loving it, underlining,
Isn't it funny?
laughing, making notations. And so tell us a little bit about the genesis of it. I mean, it obviously follows some of the trajectory of your life. Was this something when you moved back to LA and as you're preparing to launch this venture, you're saying you're trying to kind of just process what had happened and you decided to use the
I
device of a
always
novel?
I always wanted to write a novel, and I thought there were so many insane things that happen when you're in behind the camera, and it's not what people think. Like, the nature of the bizarroness is not, bosses coming in and telling you you have to promote some product or, compromise your values by backing some candidate. It's always just like a comedy of errors, and in the newsroom we always laugh about that, and so I thought it would be fun to make a sort of satire, a satire explain showing people what it's like. The funny thing is a lot of the stuff I put, some of the moments in there you can tell are overdrawn and clearly satire, but a lot of the things that people are like that would never happen are things that happen every day, and we're all like, are you crazy? People just don't think it. And then one of the that's a story about a young woman who goes into the news because she's idealistic and then, gets a little beaten down by the reality of competing to, succeed there. Um, but one of the crazy things is the plot, like the larger plot, involves a White House correspondent and a president who is a businessman who starts a unnecessary war with Venezuela to distract from the fact that he got rich by taking money from foreign governments. And he used that foreign money to finance his campaign. So I'm reading the Epstein emails today, and I'm like, and then looking at our potential battle with Venezuela and thinking, this is weird.
Well, and there's also just some really funny scenes. And one of them is the newsroom is in this total frenzy because the breaking news banner has broken or is not functioning. And someone says, well, I mean, how can we go live without having breaking news on?
And
But go
yeah,
ahead.
I wrote that like a decade ago. So it's been the case for a long time.
Well, another part that I really found kind of it was funny but also powerful is that in the story you have the news is called ATN, American Television Network, and you have a new CEO who comes in and is obviously his mission is to build audience. So he has a staff meeting and he passes out a list of prohibited words to use. And I want to read a few of them because I think it says something more broad. The words that he says are some of the words that are prohibited are affordable housing, Africa, Canada, charity, climate, compromise, consensus, disabled, education, equity, income gap, inequality, infrastructure, low income, moderate, poverty, working poor, welfare, women's health. I mean, you are saying, I think, that some of these really, really important issues are just not kind of sexy and sellable and kind of in part of at least the media
Right.
ecosystem.
Quote, not good TV.
Y-
Um, as you're reading them, it's so funny because yes, and I think about how many of those topics are in the news now. Um, but it's, because of the politics of Trump, there's a different frame on them. But still, things like, poverty, Africa, these are never like big tune in issues. And so um, it's distance, there was never an incentive to pitch on those stories. Some of the other words I put in there were yesterday, last week. One of the things you learn in news is you can never say it happened before because it doesn't feel like it's happening now. So you always say this just in, the Kennedy assassination is blah, blah, blah. So that's one thing. And yeah, there are certain topics. I mean, listen, this is one of anybody who pays close attention to the news observes that there could be mass coverage of some sort of tragedy that happens in a low income part of a city, and the news will be there for a week nonstop. And then the minute that's out of that breaking news cycle, no one ever goes back there to see, were the things that caused that remedied? What's the status of those folks? Um, I won't say that. Some people do go back there, but in general, broadly. So it's not about consistent follow up or representing our shared reality across the board. It's banging on the topics that do well. And I will say this frankly, I do that now on Instagram. Like I have to stay viral in the algorithm. So I end up focusing on the stories I know are going to have a chance at performing. And for the stuff that I think is important to know, I put it in another Instagram stories, in my newsletter, on interviews. So we are all living in a world where the incentives are so upside down. And so I understand some of this, but I do cover all those topics that you mentioned.
Well, let's talk about for a minute about just the future of news, not noise. I mean, I know as you describe your work, I mean, I know every day is a scramble and so forth. But as you pull back, I mean, where would you like this enterprise to be in 5 years or a decade? I mean, what would be your hope for how your company unfolds?
Well, I'd like to expand the newsroom so that we have a journalist who can do some original reporting, a more robust content staff to just cover more in sort of innovate new formats and get creative about how and what we share. And I'd like to help create some infrastructure that helps other creators like me have an easier time of doing their day every day and, resisting the bad incentives and seeing if there are ways to sort of bridge that gap that I've noticed between creator world and traditional journalism world and democracy world to see that there's so many ways creators are on the front lines of doing what matters in journalism, and we have lessons to teach legacy, and we have a lot to gain from partnering with them. So I hope that some new connective tissue grows, and I would just like to have a newsroom that does more on more topics, including health, wellness. I think people really need it these days.
Well, for people watching this who are saying, I really like what she's doing and I'd like to be supportive. I mean, how can they follow you? How can they subscribe? I mean,
Sure. Thanks for the you can follow me on Instagram at Jessica Yellin. You can sign up for my Substack, which is called, you can find it by searching Jessica Yellin or News Not Noise. Uh, look for my videos on YouTube, and we take donations if you want to support the growth of our newsroom. If you go to our website at newsnotnoise.com, there's a button there to make a tax deductible donation.
Great. Well, and final question. I mean, you've had such a remarkable career. As you think of maybe your 20-year-old self coming out of Harvard or students here, I mean, what sort of advice would you give to students about how to launch a professional career? What sort of thoughts they should have as they begin?
Sure. I always say think really hard about what it is that you want, not what your parents want, not what the world is saying you can do, but what is it that you want? And that's private work you do with yourself. And then you can take a lot of interviews and find out, what jobs are available, what jobs are like. You never actually know until you try it. So you got to try something. And you can change, but you have a few times you can change when you're young. Uh, And then once you're in a job, you should be smart about communicating what your goal is and let people know. And I'll give you an example. When I would meet with, when you get hired at any new TV network, you meet with their talent executives and their editorial executives and the president, and they'll ask you about yourself. And I would always say, My goal is to be a White House correspondent." And then they'd say, "Well, that's great, but you're going to be covering this crime story out of this place and this person butchering someone over there and Martha Stewart going to jail." And I would do the work I was assigned. So the first thing is you're clear about what you want and you communicate that. Then you do the thing that makes you valuable in your workplace. As long as it aligns with your integrity, do the hard work that isn't what you want. But every so often, when they ask, remind them of what you want. The only reason I got that phone call saying, "Do you want to go to Washington and cover the White House for a few weeks," which is how I ended up there, was because I had told people that that's what I wanted. And then I was willing to do all sorts of other stuff for a long time that didn't match that. So I speak at journalism schools, and people come up to me and say, "I want to be an anchor, not a reporter." And it's like, okay, good luck with that. Like, do the work and let people know I want to anchor and start getting some reps and then keep doing the reporting. So it's a give and take. You have to be of value to your workplace and you have to know yourself. And I know we live in a crazy time, so be adaptable in this world. It used to be when I was coming out of school, you want to get one of the jobs at one of the big networks. Now there are a million digital shops. Be creative, try things, and be honest with yourself when things are not lining up, and you need to make a change.
Right. Well, Jessica, thank you for such a terrific conversation and the great work you're doing. I encourage everyone to follow Jessica's work. It's really interesting. It's important. Some really great context, and I think that independent journalists of the type that Jessica is are really valuable. We don't always appreciate they're out there working in the vineyards
Yes.
trying to tell the truth in an environment that is not always conducive to that. So, Jessica, keep up the amazing work and
Thank
thank you
you.
for taking time. And maybe when time passes, we might be able to coax you to Southern Illinois to give a talk to students and
That
the
sounds
community
fun.
here about the great work you're doing.
When the news quiets down, I would love it, if ever. Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be part of your series, and I'm grateful for this really thoughtful interview and your kind remarks.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching another conversation. We will have a video of this conversation with Jessica on our website later this week or early next week. We'll have it on YouTube, so pass it on to family, friends. Support Jessica's work, and thank you for continuing to support the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute and keeping the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.